Ravaged by alcoholism and throat cancer, an A-list actor hit absolute bottom by shooting a cheap underground explicit film for a mere $5,000 flat fee. Yet this same man once stood shoulder to shoulder with Humphrey Bogart. He was Aldo Ray. What drove a celebrated war hero in Hollywood tighten down a dark slide, forced to sell the last shreds of his dignity for $5,000? This is the $5,000 humiliation, Aldo Ray's pornographic end. Many film historians argue that his psychological fracture was ignited by an exploitative studio system, setting the stage for a tragic self-destruction. Before the glitz, there was grit. Hollywood in the early 1950s was a machine designed to manufacture illusions. Studios spent millions teaching soft young men how to walk like soldiers, how to hold a rifle, and how to fake a grimace of pain. But Aldo Ray did not need a director to tell him how war felt. Born Aldo Ray in Pennsylvania in 1926, he was raised in the tough working-class sugar refining town of Crockett, California. When the world caught fire in the 1940s, he bypassed the safety of a domestic deferment and volunteered for the underwater demolition teams, the elite, highly classified amphibious units preceding the Navy SEALs. These frogmen swam miles through freezing waters into hostile enemy territory. They cleared heavily fortified beaches of submerged mines and steel obstacles, often armed with little more than a K-bar knife, explosives, and their own lung capacity. Aldo Ray saw the blood-soaked, pulverized sands of Okinawa. He lived through the kind of visceral, deafening terror that changes a human being's cellular structure. His broad, heavily muscled neck, his imposing shoulders, and that unmistakable rumbling, gravelly bark of a voice were forged in the lethal reality of combat. He survived the war. He was authentic to the bone, a trait that would ultimately become his inescapable prison. Returning to Crockett after the war, he sought a grounded life and was soon elected as the local police constable. He was a lawman, a veteran, a man of profound physical presence who dealt with the practical problems of a working-class town. This was his reality. Up to this point, everything is still ordinary, grounded, and stable. Then, in the spring of 1950, a twist of fate broke his quiet life wide open. The story goes that Aldo's brother Guido wanted to be an actor. Guido had secured an audition in San Francisco for a Columbia Pictures film about college football titled Saturday's Hero. He asked his brother, the town constable, to drive him to the casting call. Aldo agreed. He sat in the waiting room, entirely uninterested in the proceedings, wearing his everyday clothes, carrying the heavy, relaxed posture of a man who had nothing to prove. Director David Miller walked out, bypassed the polished actors desperately vying for a role, and locked eyes on the constable. Hearing Ray's raspy, unforced voice, Miller found the real, intimidating mass he needed. They asked Aldo to read a few lines. He was unpolished, entirely devoid of theatrical technique, but the camera captured something incredibly rare: total lack of pretense. In an era where the public was exhausted by the polished, theatrical dandies of the pre-war era, audiences were hungry for men who understood the grim post-war realities. They wanted survivors. Columbia Pictures recognized this immediately. They did not just see a talented newcomer, they saw a highly marketable commodity, an authentic war hero with a face that looked like it had taken a few punches and a voice that commanded immediate attention. They offered him a contract. But the machinery of power in Hollywood does not offer favors without attaching heavy chains. The first thing they stripped away was his identity. The studio executives decided Da Ray was too difficult for Middle America to pronounce. They mandated a change. He would be known as Aldo Ray. It was a minor concession, a standard industry practice, but it was the first small surrender of his autonomy. He signed the paperwork, trading his badge and his quiet town for the blinding lights of Los Angeles. He walked onto the Columbia Pictures lot as a man accustomed to the straightforward, honorable chain of command in the military. He assumed that hard work and loyalty would be met with fair compensation and respect. He believed his physical strength and genuine courage held value. He was entirely unaware that he had just walked into an industrialized psychological meat grinder run by Harry Cohn, a studio mogul notorious for treating his contract players as indentured servants. The trap had been set. The transition from a respected constable to a global superstar was about to begin, but the financial mechanics hidden within those contract pages were already laying the groundwork for a spectacular and devastating collapse. Harry Cohn did not waste time. Once Columbia Pictures had Aldo Ray under contract, the studio machine needed to immediately test the merchandise. But Cohn did not toss this former frogman into low-budget westerns to learn the ropes. The issue was not whether Ray could memorize lines. The issue was whether his raw, unpolished mass could hold the screen against seasoned theatrical veterans. In 1952, he was thrown straight into the deep end, cast in The Marrying Kind, directed by the legendary George Cukor. Cukor was Hollywood royalty, a director famous for coaxing delicate, nuanced performances from highly refined actors. Dealing with Aldo Ray was akin to asking a master sculptor to work with a block of reinforced concrete. Yet Cukor recognized the undeniable magnetic power of Ray's absolute authenticity. Ray played a working-class postal worker whose marriage is falling apart, bringing a heavy, unmannered, and completely unpretentious reality to the screen. His grief on screen was devoid of theatrical tricks. It was the genuine physical exhaustion of a blue-collar worker. The critics were stunned. They called him a breath of fresh air, a natural talent who bypassed the artificiality of the era. But internally, the psychological friction was already generating a dangerous heat. Aldo Ray did not view this process as high art. He viewed it as a bizarre, unnatural assignment where grown men sat in makeup chairs for hours to pretend to be other people. The studio doubled down on their new asset. Later that same year, they threw him into Pat and Mike, standing him directly opposite the intimidating duo of Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy. Hepburn was the undisputed queen of Hollywood intellect, sharp, aristocratic, and fiercely demanding of everyone on her sets. Ray was cast as an obtuse, dim-witted boxer named Davy Hucko. The visual contrast on screen was staggering, a perfect manifestation of drama-filled contradictions. You had Hepburn, angular, precise, and firing off dialogue like a machine gun, sharing the frame with Ray, whose thick, sloping shoulders, heavy brow, and battered-looking face made him look like a rogue bear wandering through an exclusive country club. But the dynamic worked perfectly because against Hepburn's rapid-fire delivery, Ray anchored the frame with unyielding physical presence. The public saw a rising star holding his own against cinema giants, a performance so striking it earned him a Golden Globe nomination for Most Promising Newcomer. But internally, Ray recognized his position as a highly visible novelty act. The psychological friction between his working-class, combat veteran reality and the studio's theatrical artificiality generated a quiet, unspoken alienation. By 1953, he was certified as a premier leading man. Columbia cast him opposite Rita Hayworth in Miss Sadie Thompson. Hayworth was the ultimate Hollywood goddess, a manufactured, untouchable symbol of wartime glamour. Ray was cast opposite her as the rugged, fiercely protective Marine Sergeant Phil O'Hara. Here, the studio began overtly weaponizing his past. They strapped him back into a military uniform, slapped a chevron on his sleeve, and commanded him to project the very trauma and masculine stoicism he had actually lived through. Every time he stepped in front of a camera, in a uniform, the studio was mining his authentic military experience, commodifying his actual grit to sell movie tickets. He delivered his lines with a heavy physical exhaustion and a simmering quiet aggression that actors who spent the war sipping martinis in Hollywood nightclubs could never replicate. Audiences devoured the authenticity. The film was a massive commercial success, proving that Ray could carry a blockbuster on his broad shoulders. Then came the summit of his early career. In 1955, Paramount Pictures borrowed him for the comedy We're No Angels, placing him alongside Humphrey Bogart and Peter Ustinov. Bogart was the absolute gold standard of cinematic tough guys, the undisputed king of the trench coat and the loaded pistol. But Bogart's toughness, while legendary, was largely an impeccable cinematic construction. When Aldo Ray stepped onto the set, the entire dynamic of masculinity shifted. Bogart, an exceptionally intelligent and perceptive man, immediately recognized that Ray was not playing a character. Ray was simply existing on camera with the dormant, coiled energy of a real killer. They played escaped convicts, and Ray brought a hulking, quiet menace mixed with a strange, almost childlike vulnerability. He did not have to manufacture a menacing glare. He just stared with the flat, dead-eyed assessment of a man who had cleared underwater mines. To the outside world, Aldo Ray had conquered Hollywood. He was on the cover of magazines, mobbed by frantic fans at premieres, and cemented as a top-tier box office draw, standing shoulder to shoulder with Bogart himself. However, physical manifestations of his internal unease surfaced. His visible stiffness during studio-mandated press junkets and traditional romantic scenes revealed a man whose working-class pride was fundamentally offended by the performative nature of his new profession. The disconnect between his marketed alpha male image and the reality of endless, superficial promotional tours felt profoundly emasculating. He was starring opposite Bogart, Tracy, and Hayworth. He was generating millions of dollars in ticket sales across the globe. He was an A-list star in every measurable metric of public fame. But power in Hollywood is not measured by applause, and it is certainly not measured by Golden Globe nominations. It is measured by ink on a contract. While the world believed Aldo Ray was a millionaire, swimming in the luxurious spoils of his hard-won victory, the truth was far more sinister. The studio bosses were looking at the massive box office receipts, patting him on his broad shoulders, and then quietly enforcing an arrangement that was practically criminal in its exploitation. Up to this point, the public saw a hero bathed in glory, and Ray himself was trying to play the game like a good soldier following orders. But behind the heavy oak doors of the studio executive suites, the trap Harry Cohn had set was snapping shut. Aldo Ray's restrictive contract was standard for naive newcomers, but Harry Cohn and Columbia Pictures deliberately weaponized his military obedience to bind him in near-feudal servitude. The mechanics of the classic Hollywood studio system reveal the sheer scale of the theft. In the 1950s, actors did not operate as free agents. They were exclusive property. When Ray initially signed his paperwork, he approached it like a military enlistment. You sign the paper, you do the grueling work, you follow the chain of command, and the organization takes care of you. He lacked the predatory, cutthroat instincts of a seasoned Hollywood negotiator. He was a small-town constable who thought $500 a week was a small fortune, and for a brief moment, it was. But the studio knew exactly what they were purchasing: an unrefined gold mine. Aldo Ray was locked into a long-term contract that paid him a flat, unyielding rate of $500 a week, regardless of how much money a film generated, regardless of whether his name was positioned above the title on the marquee. His compensation remained stagnant. But Columbia Pictures did not just use him in their own films. They treated him like high-yield livestock. When rival studios like Paramount or Warner Brothers wanted the hottest new tough guy for their own prestige pictures, Harry Cohn would agree to loan him out. Cohn would charge the rival studio an exorbitant fee, $5,000 a week for the services of Aldo Ray. Paramount would write a check to Columbia Pictures for $5,000. Columbia Pictures would then hand Aldo Ray his standard $500, quietly pocketing a massive $4,500 profit every single week, simply for holding the lease on his life. This was the original $5,000 humiliation. It was a staggering disparity. Ray was starring alongside Humphrey Bogart, carrying the emotional weight of multi-million-dollar productions, driving massive box office revenues across the globe. Yet, he was being paid less than some of the studio executives' personal secretaries. The gap between how the public perceived his immense success and his actual restrictive financial reality was utterly paralyzing. Fans saw a titan in bespoke suits attending glamorous premieres. Behind closed doors, Ray was agonizing over the reality that he was generating empires of wealth for men who looked down on him from their leather-bound executive suites. He was not a partner in his own success. He was a highly functional piece of heavy machinery, rented out to the highest bidder. This financial subjugation struck directly at his fatal weakness, his pride. He was a combat veteran who had stared death in the face on the beaches of Okinawa. He understood discipline, and he understood hardship, but his psychological framework demanded mutual respect. The realization that he was being legally robbed and treated as a disposable asset by men who had spent the war safely behind mahogany desks offended his deepest sense of masculinity. It was a profound psychological emasculation. He could not challenge Harry Cohn to a physical fight. He could not breach the ironclad legal barriers of his contract without facing complete industry blacklisting. He was trapped. The system had successfully placed a financial chokehold on a man who had survived underwater minefields. The physical manifestations of this internal rage began to surface on the sets. Instead of the violent tantrums typical of spoiled theatrical stars, his rebellion was quiet, dark, and corrosive. He began to drink. Initially, a deliberate act of defiance against the executives who owned his image, the alcohol became an all-consuming fire. If the studio owned his time, his image, and his labor, then the only thing he could control was his own blood chemistry. He started keeping a flask in his trailer. Then he started bringing the flask onto the sound stages. The alcohol was a buffer, a chemical shield between his wounded pride and the condescending directors who barked orders at him like he was an uneducated brute. He would sit in his canvas chair staring at the manicured producers with flat, contemptuous eyes, slowly sipping his liquor, daring them to say something. They rarely did. As long as he hit his marks and delivered the menacing, authentic presence they were selling to the public, the studio executives looked the other way. They tolerated his drinking because he was still profitable. They assumed they could control the beast they had chained. But this psychological coping mechanism was a fatal miscalculation. He thought he was punishing the studio by being difficult. He thought he was retaining a shred of his autonomy by refusing to be a sober, compliant puppet. In reality, he was laying the foundation for his own complete destruction. The alcohol did not hurt Harry Cohn. It did not alter the terms of his indentured servitude. It only began to eat away at the one asset he truly owned, his physical body. Up to this point, his drinking was a manageable, almost romanticized vice. He was still the rugged, handsome leading man who could handle his liquor. But the industry's tolerance was entirely conditional. The moment the scale tipped from profitable rebel to liability, the system would not hesitate to discard him. By the late 1950s, the cinematic lens documented Ray's severe physical decline. His initial reliance on alcohol as a buffer against studio humiliation had transitioned into absolute dependency. The metabolic toll was explicit. He gained significant weight, losing the athletic silhouette that defined his early career. Chronic flush and a network of broken capillaries fundamentally altered his facial structure on camera. The deadpan menace in his eyes was replaced by a glassy, bloodshot exhaustion. The athletic silhouette of his early career vanished. He no longer moved with the coiled, predatory grace of a soldier. Instead, he lumbered heavily across the sound stages. His breathing labored under the tight collars of his costumes. The tipping point of this public deterioration occurred during the production of the 1958 World War II epic, The Naked and the Dead. Based on Norman Mailer's landmark novel, this was supposed to be a monumental cinematic event, and Aldo Ray was cast in the pivotal commanding role of Sergeant Croft. It was a role tailor-made for his authentic military background, a hardened, ruthless platoon leader leading men through a jungle meat grinder. But the reality on set was a grotesque parody of military discipline. Producer Paul Gregory later provided a damning, unvarnished testimony of the production. He stated plainly that Ray was completely intoxicated throughout the entire filming process. He was knocking back hard liquor from the moment he woke up in his trailer until the camera stopped rolling at dusk. Drinking on set was merely a symptom. The terminal diagnosis was his transformation into an uninsurable liability within Hollywood's ruthless ecosystem. Hollywood is a town that will happily forgive moral bankruptcy, and it will even overlook catastrophic personal scandals, provided the actor remains profitable. But Hollywood will never, under any circumstances, forgive an uninsurable liability. And that is exactly what Aldo Ray had become. Behind the glitz of the premieres and the power of the studio executives, the true silent rulers of the film industry are the insurance actuaries. A movie production is a multi-million-dollar logistical machine. If a lead actor cannot stand his mark, if he cannot remember his lines, or if he delays a shoot by passing out in his dressing room, the daily costs skyrocket into the hundreds of thousands. As Ray's physical appearance bloated and his on-set reliability disintegrated, the insurance companies quietly, ruthlessly pulled the plug. They simply refused to bond any production that cast him in a leading role. The studio executives, who had happily squeezed millions out of his $500 a week contract, did not attempt to stage an intervention. They did not offer medical assistance or rehabilitation. When the golden goose became too sick to lay eggs, they simply unlocked the cage and kicked him out into the cold. As the major studio doors slammed shut in the 1960s, Ray's financial foundation, which was already fundamentally crippled by his exploitative contract, completely collapsed. And this collapse was rapidly accelerated by the devastation of his personal life. He did not just lose his professional standing, he lost his home front. He was a man who craved the stability of a traditional, grounded life, a desire born from his working-class roots in Crockett. But the psychological torment of his career made him an impossible partner. He went through 3 marriages, to Shirley Green, to the actress Jeff Donnell, and finally to Johanna Ray. Each marriage buckled under the weight of his erratic behavior, his smoldering resentments, and the constant destructive presence of the bottle. The divorces were not just emotional tragedies, they were financial executions. His domestic ruin was dictated by brutal mathematics. Because he had never been paid his true market value during his peak years, he did not possess the vast insulated fortunes of his A-list peers. He had no diversified investment portfolios. He had no sprawling real estate empire to liquidate. Whatever meager savings he had managed to scrape together from his Columbia Pictures salary were systematically obliterated by lawyers, alimony payments, and child support settlements. Every divorce decree took a pound of flesh. By 1976, he would stand before reporters, his face heavy with exhaustion, and bitterly confess that women and the family court system had entirely stripped him of his assets. He found himself in his 50s, entirely broke, alienated from his children, and exiled from the upper echelons of the industry he had helped to build. The A-list scripts stopped arriving. They were replaced by desperate, low-budget television guest spots and humiliating supporting roles in forgotten B-movies. He was forced to travel to Europe to shoot cheap, dubiously funded spaghetti westerns and crime thrillers, trading on the faded memory of his 1950s glory to pay for his next meal. He was a ghost haunting the fringes of his own profession. The public, if they thought of him at all, assumed he was quietly enjoying a wealthy retirement. They had no idea that the man who had once been the ultimate symbol of American cinematic toughness was now answering the phone in a cramped apartment, begging his agent for a 3-day shoot on a television show just to cover his utility bills. Up to this point, his punishment seemed severe, but standard for a fallen star. It was the classic Hollywood tragedy of a man who drank away his fortune. He was surviving barely in the murky, unglamorous basement of the entertainment world. He thought he had hit rock bottom. He thought the worst the industry could do to him had already been done. The financial bleeding and the loss of his leading man status were only the preliminary consequences. The true penalty for his rebellion had not yet materialized. The decades of heavy drinking and chain smoking had planted a silent, lethal time bomb inside his own throat. And when the plot twist finally arrived, it would not target his bank account or his fading looks. It would aggressively target the very last weapon he possessed, setting the stage for a desperate decision that would permanently annihilate his legacy. The 1970s were an absolute wasteland for Aldo Ray. The new Hollywood era had arrived, bringing a tidal wave of young counterculture directors like Scorsese and Coppola, who favored raw, neurotic, urban actors like De Niro and Pacino. Ray, with his fading 1950s tough guy persona and his undeniable reputation as an alcoholic liability, was an archaic relic. He was completely exiled from the mainstream studio lots where he had once reigned as a premier asset. The man who had traded sharp dialogue with Katharine Hepburn was now relegated to the swampy, humiliating margins of the industry. He was forced to accept roles that, a decade earlier, his agent would have thrown in the trash without reading. He played a generic lawman in Bogart, an obscure, low-budget blaxploitation film. He took one-day shoots on television shows, heavily relying on off-camera cue cards, because his alcohol-soaked memory could no longer reliably retain the scripts. The issue driving these decisions was blunt, terrifying survival. Aldo Ray was aging, his body was rapidly breaking down, and he was staring directly down the barrel of a uniquely American nightmare, losing his health care. In the entertainment industry, the Screen Actors Guild provides health insurance, but that coverage is entirely conditional. It is a ruthless, unforgiving quota system. An actor must earn a specific financial threshold or work a certain number of days in front of the camera each year to qualify for medical benefits. If you miss the quota, your safety net is immediately revoked. For a man in his 50s whose internal organs had been battered by decades of heavy drinking and chain smoking, losing health insurance was a literal death sentence. He was trapped in a grueling, humiliating hamster wheel. He had to accept absolutely any role, no matter how degrading, poorly written, or cheaply produced, simply to punch his time card and keep his medical benefits active. He was no longer an artist. He was a hostage to his own failing biology. The gap between his internal intentions, simply surviving another year without going medically bankrupt, and the public reality, a fallen star doing garbage cinema, was a chasm of pure humiliation. The public saw a man who had squandered his talent and hit the bottom. The reality was a man sitting in a cramped apartment calculating how many hours he had to endure on a miserable set just to cover a trip to the doctor. And this relentless, grinding desperation paved the road to the year 1979. It was the year the trapdoor opened beneath the basement he was already living in. By 1979, the adult entertainment industry was desperately seeking mainstream legitimacy. The producers of these films craved one thing above all else: mainstream legitimacy. They wanted recognizable names from standard Hollywood to validate their explicit content. They knew they could not afford working stars, so they scavenged the wreckage of the industry, looking for desperate, bankrupt names whose pride had already been beaten out of them. They found Aldo Ray. The proposition was placed on the table, a Western-themed adult film titled Sweet Savage. Aldo Ray was hired to play the primary antagonist, a hardened, villainous character named Banner. The contract stipulated that he would shoot his dialogue and his dramatic scenes, and then he would physically leave the set. The explicit scenes would be filmed entirely separately. In his own mind, driven by his fatal weakness of desperate pride, Ray almost certainly rationalized this arrangement. He convinced himself it was just another acting gig, just a cowboy picture, a quick in-and-out job to secure a paycheck and hit his Screen Actors Guild insurance quota. But the producers of Sweet Savage did not pay him for his acting. They paid for the rights to drag his A-list history through the mud. They explicitly weaponized his legacy. When the film was released, the marketing posters did not hide his involvement. They practically screamed it in neon lights. They plastered the name of a Golden Globe-nominated star across underground exploitation posters. The visual reality of his presence in the film is profoundly depressing. He is not standing on a meticulously dressed Columbia Pictures soundstage, lit by master technicians. He is standing in the cheap, flat, garish lighting of a rushed exploitation shoot. His face is heavily weathered, carrying the thick, undeniable weight of a man deeply exhausted by life. The gravelly voice that once commanded genuine respect on the battlefields of Okinawa and held its own against Humphrey Bogart was now barking out wooden dialogue in an underground exploitation feature. Hollywood will forgive moral bankruptcy, and it will often forgive criminal behavior if the box office returns are high enough, but it will never forgive a star who reminds the public that actors are just desperate people who need a paycheck. He had crossed a boundary that the major studios considered an absolute unforgivable taboo. Taking a role in a bad B-movie is considered a slump. Taking a role in an underground exploitation feature is a permanent excommunication. The studio bosses who had ruthlessly exploited him in his youth now looked at him with absolute hypocritical disgust. They had created the financial conditions that bankrupted him. They had blacklisted him when his coping mechanisms ruined his health, and now they washed their hands of him completely, citing his indecent choices. The producers of Sweet Savage knew they held all the leverage over a desperate, bankrupt actor. They offered him a mere $5,000 flat fee. In 1979, the cycle violently closed. At his peak, Columbia had leased his physical prime to rival studios for $5,000 a week, while paying him a fraction of that. Now, standing under the harsh lights of an underground set, Ray surrendered the last shreds of his legacy for that exact same figure. But the true visceral horror of this career choice did not fully manifest until the following year. In 1980, the adult film industry decided to hold its own version of the Academy Awards. They called it the Adult Film Association Erotica Awards. The organizers, desperate to borrow a shred of mainstream credibility, nominated Aldo Ray for Best Actor for his role as the villain in Sweet Savage, and he won. This is a man who, in 1952, sat in the ballroom of the Ambassador Hotel, surrounded by the absolute titans of the silver screen, receiving a Golden Globe nomination for his work opposite Katharine Hepburn. He had been anointed as the future of American cinema. Now, visualize the stark, brutal contrast of the 1980 Erotica Awards. Standing in a tired suit among the opportunistic bottom feeders of Los Angeles, a combat veteran of Okinawa accepted a trophy for a low-budget, explicit film. When his name was called, Aldo Ray, a combat veteran of the United States Navy, a man who had cleared submerged mines under enemy fire in Okinawa, had to physically stand up, walk across a cheap stage, and accept an award for an explicit, low-budget adult film. The gap between what he intended, simply doing a job to pay his medical bills, and what actually happened, becoming the poster child for Hollywood degradation, was a chasm of absolute humiliation. The media reaction was swift, but it was not outraged. Outrage implies a violation of an expected standard. Outrage implies that the public still holds you in high regard and is shocked by your fall. The press did not treat Aldo Ray with outrage. They treated him with something infinitely more destructive to a proud man. They treated him with overwhelming condescending pity. The newspapers and entertainment magazines did not review Sweet Savage as a piece of cinema. They reviewed it as the tragic autopsy of a dead career. They published photographs of his bloated, exhausted face next to old, glamorous studio portraits from the 1950s, creating a side-by-side visual timeline of a man who had completely destroyed himself. The psychological defense mechanisms of a desperate man are a fascinating and heartbreaking thing to witness. When confronted by reporters about his involvement in the film and his subsequent award, Aldo Ray did not break down in tears. He did not issue a tearful, dramatic Hollywood apology. He relied on the exact same working-class, blue-collar pragmatism that he had brought with him from the sugar-refining town of Crockett. He stared back at the journalists with his bloodshot eyes, his raspy voice entirely devoid of theatricality, and delivered a line that serves as the ultimate treat for anyone studying the psychology of a fallen star. He simply said, "I haven't done anything wrong. I'm an actor. I was hired to do a job, and I did it." It is a powerful, staggering quote because it reveals the absolute disconnect between his internal reality and the external world. In his mind, he was still just a laborer. He was a guy clocking in for a shift. If the foreman tells you to dig a ditch, you dig the ditch, you take your pay, and you go home. He completely failed to understand that in the business of manufacturing illusions, your brand, your prestige, and your perceived moral standing are your actual currency. By treating an adult film like just another day at the factory, he had permanently bankrupted his cultural currency. He believed he was retaining his honor by refusing to be ashamed of honest work. The public, however, only saw a king digging through the trash. The Hollywood establishment, the very men who had created the suffocating financial conditions that pushed him to this extreme, used the Sweet Savage incident to permanently wash their hands of him. It provided them with the perfect self-righteous excuse to ignore their own complicity in his downfall. They could point to the erotica ward and say, "We didn't ruin him. He ruined himself. He made indecent choices." The studio bosses who had treated him like livestock in the 1950s now suddenly possessed the moral high ground. The blacklisting was no longer just an unspoken insurance issue. It was a permanent cultural excommunication. Aldo Ray walked away from that award ceremony with a cheap trophy and a few $1,000s that would quickly be swallowed by rent, groceries, and union dues. He had sacrificed the absolute last vestige of his dignity for a temporary financial bandage. The $5,000 humiliation was complete. His name was a punchline. His legacy was heavily stained. The industry had locked the gates behind him, and he was left standing in the cold, holding an award that he could never display on a mantle. But the tragedy of human endurance is that the body keeps breathing even after the spirit has been utterly crushed. You can survive public humiliation. You can survive bankruptcy. You can even survive being the laughing stock of the industry you helped build. Up to this point, everything was still, in a morbid, depressing way, survivable. He was still waking up every day. He was still occasionally picking up scraps of work in obscure, direct-to-video garbage just to keep his health insurance active. He probably thought he had seen the absolute worst life had to offer. He had hit the concrete bottom and he was simply going to scrape along it until he died of old age. But the plot twist is in the year 1989. The universe was not finished extracting its toll. The Erotica Award was merely the destruction of his public image. The decades of heavy drinking, the relentless stress, and the ceaseless chain smoking were quietly keeping their own ledger inside his body. He had spent his entire adult life pouring literal poison down his throat to numb the psychological pain of his career. And that very habit was about to come back and collect a debt that could not be paid with a $5,000 check. The physical rot that had already claimed his leading man looks was about to target the one defining iconic attribute he had left. The true, final horror was not going to play out on a cheap movie set or at a sleazy award show. It was going to play out in the sterile, terrifyingly quiet rooms of a hospital ward, where his most famous weapon would be systematically carved out of his body. The biological bill for his quiet rebellion finally arrived in 1989. For decades, Aldo Ray had used alcohol and unfiltered cigarettes not just as a vice, but as a deeply flawed psychological shield. He drank to numb the profound humiliation of being legally robbed by Columbia Pictures. He smoked to project the unyielding tough guy persona the studios demanded of him, long after his own internal confidence had shattered. But the human body does not care about studio contracts, and it does not care about the psychological justifications for addiction. The body simply keeps a meticulous, unforgiving ledger of every poison introduced to it. The diagnosis was brutally straightforward: malignant throat cancer. The very coping mechanisms he had deployed to survive the psychological pressure of Hollywood had now mutated into a lethal biological debt. The very coping mechanisms he had deployed to survive the suffocating pressure of his Hollywood career had now mutated into a lethal biological weapon inside his own flesh. The tumor targeted his larynx. The medical intervention required to halt the cancer was aggressive and clinically destructive. Surgeons operated on his neck, followed by extensive radiation therapy. The treatment permanently stripped away his remaining physical mass and, crucially, destroyed his vocal cords. The gravelly bark was completely destroyed. The weapon that had made him a millionaire on paper was permanently silenced. He was left with nothing but a weak, strained, and raspy whisper. He could no longer deliver dialogue. He could no longer bark orders on screen. The Hollywood machine had taken his youth, his labor, and his dignity. Now, his own body had taken his voice. The transformation was agonizingly complete. The imposing UDT frogman, who had once commanded absolute attention with a single word, was now a frail, mute shadow, struggling to draw breath. This catastrophic loss of his voice completely severed his final tenuous connection to the entertainment industry. A disgraced actor can occasionally find work in exploitation films. A mute, disgraced actor is entirely useless to the camera. The meager income from his humiliating roles evaporated entirely. The Screen Actors Guild health insurance, the very safety net he had degraded himself in Sweet Savage to maintain, was pushed to its absolute limits by the staggering costs of oncology treatments in the American medical system. By 1990, the financial and physical reality of his situation forced a profoundly symbolic relocation. When major Hollywood stars fall terminally ill, they typically retreat to the luxurious, highly guarded private suites of Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Beverly Hills. Surrounded by elite specialists, publicists, and mountains of floral arrangements sent by studio executives. Aldo Ray did not go to Cedars-Sinai. He was completely broke, alienated from his former A-list peers, and carrying the permanent stain of the adult film industry. He was admitted to the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Martinez, California. This is a critical, glaring contradiction that defines his entire life story. He had spent 40 years in the most glamorous artificial industry on the planet, generating massive wealth and international fame. Yet, at the absolute end of his life, the film industry provided him with absolutely nothing. He was forced to fall back on the only institution that recognized his actual foundational worth, the United States military. The VA hospital did not admit him because he starred alongside Katharine Hepburn. They admitted him because a half a century earlier, he had cleared submerged explosives off the beaches of Okinawa. The atmosphere of the VA Medical Center in Martinez was a stark, unforgiving contrast to the world he had once inhabited. Stripped of velvet ropes and flashbulbs, the quiet, clinical reality of government-funded healthcare remained. Linoleum floors, the hum of fluorescent lights, and the slow, collective fading of old soldiers. In these sterile wards, the illusion of Aldo Ray the movie star was finally permanently stripped away. He reverted back to Aldo Ray, the exhausted Navy veteran. The isolation of those final months was profound. The men who had profited immensely from his labor in the 1950s, the producers, the studio heads, the agents, did not visit. The industry operates on a strict policy of forward momentum. It does not waste time looking back at the casualties it leaves behind. His 3 marriages had long since disintegrated under the weight of his alcoholism and financial ruin, leaving his personal relationships deeply fractured. He spent his days in the quiet ward, his body rapidly deteriorating from the cancer and the onset of severe pneumonia, communicating primarily through weak gestures and strained whispers. He had started his journey as a man who desired a simple, grounded life in a small sugar refining town. He had been violently pulled into a machine that demanded he project a monolithic, invincible masculinity to the world. He had fought that machine the only way he knew how, and he had lost everything in the process. The cancer was merely the physical executioner. His spirit had been systematically dismantled decades prior. On March 27, 1991, the long, grueling slide finally came to a halt. At the age of 64, his battered heart stopped beating. Aldo Ray died in that quiet veterans hospital, far removed from the flashing lights of Los Angeles, suffocating from pneumonia and the ravages of throat cancer. To the casual observer, the story ends in that hospital bed, a tragic but ultimately standard narrative of a Hollywood star who drank himself to death and died broke. His solitary death was tragic, but the industry's subsequent response delivered a final chilling verdict. Because while his body finally found rest on that late March day, the Hollywood machine had one final posthumous verdict to deliver. The ultimate proof of his absolute erasure from the golden annals of cinema wouldn't happen in the hospital room. It would happen in the dirt. Hollywood knows exactly how to bury its royalty. When a studio legend dies, the industry halts. The trade magazines print massive black-bordered tributes. The studios release carefully curated press statements, mourning the loss of a cinematic giant. Elaborate funerals are held in Beverly Hills, attended by an army of publicists, producers, and weeping co-stars, ensuring the star's final exit is as impeccably lit and heavily promoted as their film premieres. But for Aldo Ray, the man who once generated millions of dollars and stood shoulder to shoulder with Humphrey Bogart, the Hollywood machinery remained completely, deafeningly silent. He received neither grand eulogies nor studio-funded monuments. His remains were cremated, placed in an urn, and sent back to Crockett, California. He returned to the gritty, blue-collar sugar refining town where he had once served as a police constable, long before David Miller ever heard his gravelly voice in that San Francisco waiting room. For a man who had lived under the blinding, artificial lights of global fame, his final resting place was staggeringly quiet. Historical records show he was interred with virtually no fanfare. For years, he did not even have a proper, dignified headstone fitting for a man who carried major motion pictures. The industry had extracted every ounce of his youth, his labor, and his dignity. Once his body finally gave out in that veterans hospital, they erased him from the earth. The A-list aura was scrubbed clean, leaving nothing but an urn in a small-town cemetery. As we close the book on Aldo Ray, it forces us to reflect on the unseen human cost behind the silver screen. The men and women who built the foundation of modern cinematic entertainment were often treated as disposable raw materials. The tragedy of Aldo Ray is not an isolated incident. It is a dark feature of an industrialized studio system obsessed with youth, extreme profitability, and absolute control. It is a moral debt owed by a town that happily consumes the prime years of its stars, pockets the millions, and leaves the broken vessels to shatter in the dark.